Okay, so now we've got Max open. There is a couple of things we need to do before we can start modeling in any way. We need to set our units and our system scale. So we go to Customize, Unit Setup, and we make sure metric is set to centimeters, and we hit, before we hit OK, we go into System Unit Setup, and we make sure that 1 unit equals 1 centimeter, and we hit OK to both of those. So now we know that whenever we create something, it is using a real world scale, and we know that we can create it to the height or whatever we need to. So in Selena's case, I know that she is 170 centimeters tall, so when I create her image planes, I will make it so her height is 170 centimeters tall. Okay, so to do that, we'll start by moving into the left viewport. So we'll hit the toggle button down, the viewport toggle button down the bottom here, and we'll hit left and just to the toggle again, so we can maximize our viewport. So just having a look at this, these two dark lines here on the grid indicates the center point of the world. So this point here is 0, 0, 0 in X, Y, and Z. This is important. We want everything to be either 0, 0, 0, or depending on what if we're creating a pivot point or something, the pivot will obviously be in a different spot, but for now we want everything to be at 0 in the world space. So to create our first image plane, we'll just go over into the Create tab and we'll select Plane, and we'll just click and draw a square, or as close to a square. It doesn't need perfect right now. Over here in the parameters rollout, we want to make sure the length and the width are at the height of our character that we need. So now when we created our image planes in Photoshop, we made sure that they were a perfect square. So now when we create this plane, as long as it's a square, when we apply our image to it, we know that it won't be stretched or distorted in any way. So if we put the length, we set the length and the width to 170 because that is the height of Selena. So if your character is taller or shorter, you can change the width and the height to suit your character's height. And we want the segments here. 4 is too many for an image plane. We only want 1, so we just right click on the arrows here and it'll reset to 1. We'll hit W on our keyboard to move into the Move tool, and we want to make sure we center this. So down here in the X, Y, and Z transform functions, again, just right click on the arrows to zero them out. Now, obviously, when we create our character, we want her feet to be on the ground level, which is this dark line here. So at the moment, you can see if we imagine that our image plane is on here and we modeled our character, she'd be half through the floor. And we don't want that, obviously. We want her feet to be on the floor. So we want to move this up in the Y. I beg your pardon, the Z. So we just 170, half of that is 85. So we move that 85 up so that the base of the square is sitting on the ground floor. Now, we want to get the manipulator tool back on the ground floor at 0, 0, 0 again. This just makes it easier to move everything if everything is at the same level as our character. So her feet will be on the floor, so we want our pivot on our image plane to be at the floor as well. It's not necessary, but it's always the best way to do it, especially since we're going to clone this in a minute. So if we go into the Hierarchy tab, we go Effect Pivot Only, and we want to zero these out again so that the pivot is now on 0 in the world space. We just hit Effect Pivot Off again. So now we've moved back in, and that has adjusted the pivot on our square. So when I say pivot, I mean this is where it'll pivot from when we rotate. So when I go into rotate now, either by hitting the rotate button at the top or hitting E on the keyboard, if we rotate, it's going to rotate from this pivot point around the center at the world 0 in the world space. Okay, if we left it where it was, it would have pivoted or rotated around the center point here, which is a little undesirable at the moment. So what we want to do now is we'll switch to shaded so we can see what's going on, and we will convert the plane into an editable poly. So that's just by right clicking and selecting editable poly, and I'll switch back into perspective mode so you can see what we're doing here. And you can see that the rotate, I forgot to undo the rotate, so if I just go back, make sure that is completely straight, and I'll go, so just Control Z until I was going to undo everything, and then I'll go back into an editable poly. Okay, so now what we want to do as well is we want to right click on our object with it selected and go into Object Properties, and we want to turn on Backface Culling, and we want to turn off Show Frozen in Grey, and hit OK. So now what that will do is we'll explain Show Frozen in Grey in a minute, but at the moment if we turn around here, you can see that we can no longer see the face of our plane. So that is so when we're modeling our character, when we're working on the front, and when we have to turn around to work at the back, we can see what we're doing, and we don't have to try and work around and move the plane out of the way. Okay, so now we've got that one done. What we want to do is go into the top view and go into rotate mode, so hitting E on the keyboard, holding shift. First actually we'll turn on the snap tool. So that's this tool up here with a little magnet with the angle snap through, and we'll right click on that to make sure, yep, we're snapping every 10% and on an angle of 5, so we'll just hit OK. Then we'll go back into the top viewport, hold down shift, and we will rotate the image plane so until we hit 90 degrees. And when we release, it'll bring up the clone options. You have the option of doing a copy, an instance, or a reference. In this case, we want it to leave it as a copy. We'll go OK. Just moving back into the move tool by hitting W. So now you can see we've got two planes that are intersecting each other at the world space. What we'll do is we'll go into the front view, and I'll make that shaded again just by clicking on the name and selecting shaded. So selecting that, and I'm just going to rename it over here in the modifier tab, so when I search for it I can find it easily. So we'll just call this front, and we'll call this one side. Okay, so now we also want to move these back so we can build our character on the 0 point in the world space. So if we grab this and we'll just move this back to 85 should be fine, and we'll move this one back again to 85 again. So now we've got basically two walls touching. Okay, now what we want to do is bring up our material editor so we can actually apply our images to these planes. So if we hit M on the keyboard, it'll bring up our material editor. And we've got this one here. Now you can do it so you can apply each material will have a different image on it, and you just apply them differently to each plane. The way I like to do it is to keep everything tidy, and so I don't have materials all over the place. For the image planes, I like to use a multi-sub object. So that's basically like creating a layer for each of your image planes within the one shader. So what we'll do is we'll go to default one, which is fine, and we'll hit where it says standard. We'll click on that, and it'll bring up the map browser, or the material map browser. And here in this pop-out, we want to scroll down until we find multi-sub object and select that, hit OK. It'll ask you if you want to replace or keep or replace the discard or keep the material. It doesn't matter either way, just hit OK, because we haven't actually made a material yet. We'll go into set number. We don't need 10, we only need 2, because we've got 2 images that we want to apply. So we'll just hit 2 and hit OK. So just set number and 2. So now we've only got 2 materials within this shader. For the default one, we'll just click on that. We will rename it to front image plane, and where it says diffuse, on the little empty square that's next to it, click on that. It'll bring up the material map browser again. At the top, you want to select bitmap, double click on that, and now you'll need to navigate to wherever it is that you saved your image. So we just select the front image and we'll hit open. So now that's applied that as a map. So if you hit go parent, it'll go back to the top of that material. We make sure that show shaded material in viewport is selected. So we just click that, make sure it's highlighted, and we'll go back to the top again, hitting the go to parent button. So it's a little sphere shape with an arrow pointing up. We'll do the same for the next material, which are underneath it. Now this one, it'll ask us to apply what kind of material it is again. So when we hit this one, it'll ask us, well, what is it? We'll say standard this time. So we'll double click there on the standard, and now we'll go down here in diffuse. First we'll name it side image plane, and we'll go to the diffuse, so click on the blank square, select bitmap again, and this time we want to select, it doesn't matter which one, it's probably easier to start with Selena 1, where the arm is separate from the torso. Hit open, hit go to parent again, and make sure that show material in viewport is selected, and then we'll go to the parent object. So now we have 2 materials inside this one shader. And I'll just go back in here and make sure the naming convention is the same as the top one. So it's both side and front underscore image plane. And what we need to do also now is to take note of the material IDs. So if we grab both of these planes in the viewport and we go assign material to selection, you'll see that both of these image planes have an ID of 1, so they're both showing the front image plane. Now obviously that's not what we want, that's not very desirable. We obviously want the side to be shown on the side image. So if we go into the left viewport again, just by hitting the toggle, selecting left and toggle again to make it full screen, and we click on our image plane, go into element mode and select the plane again, and we'll scroll down just by clicking an empty spot and scrolling down. I'll actually move this up a little bit until we get to polygon material IDs. So where it says set ID, we need to change this from 1 to number 2 where our ID for our side image plane has been set. So if we hit 2 and hit enter, you'll notice that when we click off, you can see it a bit better. Our side image plane is now showing up on our side image in our viewport. Okay, so that's the material assigning done. So if we can close that now. Actually, I'll bring that back up, and because I just realized we need to name our actual shader. So just to make everything nice and neat and tidy. And we can close that again and toggle down into the perspective mode. So select them. Now before we made these, when we changed our object properties, we changed it so they don't go grey when we freeze them. Now the reason we did this is because we want to apply them to our own layers, so we can freeze them so we can't accidentally delete or adjust them when we're modeling. So if we click the layers palette, our layer will show up. I'll just shrink this a little bit. So we've already got a default layer, so that's the layer by default, but we want to create a new one. So if we select both of these and we hit the new layer button, and we'll name it image planes layer, it's put both of those images, because they were selected within the layer automatically. So now what we want to do is just hit the freeze little button here. So that basically means we can no longer touch these by accident. So you cannot select them in any way, shape or form, but we can still use them to model as reference. Okay, and that is it. That's our image plane set up and ready to go, ready to start modeling.